It begins with dust, grains of it caught in the breath of the desert, whispering over forgotten ruins. Beneath them lies everything we once were, and everything we have chosen to forget. History, we're told, is a ladder, step by step, from ignorance to light. But if you listen closely, beneath the museums and timelines, there is another sound, the echo of something older, something that doesn't fit the order we've built around ourselves. Every civilization leaves behind its monuments, but also its silences. Beneath those silences, buried under centuries of pride and erosion, lie fragments that refuse to explain themselves, alloys that shouldn't exist, tools carved from impossible materials, maps of skies no human could have charted. They don't announce themselves as miracles or conspiracies. They simply sit in the earth, waiting for someone willing to ask, how long have we really been here? In the 19th century, a handful of explorers began to ask that question, quietly at first. Their findings were met not with celebration, but with locked drawers, sealed archives, and revised textbooks. What they unearthed threatened not a religion or a nation, but something even more fragile, our sense of progress. Because if humanity has risen before, it means we've also fallen. And if knowledge can be lost once, it can be lost again. The sands of Egypt, the caves of Ecuador, the forests of the Amazon, each holds its own language of ruin, whispers of a story too complex to fit our categories of ancient or modern. The more we uncover, the less linear the tale becomes. Machines that predate metallurgy, mathematics engraved on stone long before calculus, civilizations that understood harmony, ecology, and the human mind better than we do today. The temptation is to dismiss it all, to file it away under myth, pseudoscience, or wishful thinking. But what if those fragments aren't fabrications? What if they are the residue of a cycle that repeats itself, a rhythm of discovery, loss, and rediscovery that defines what it means to be human? Beneath every act of excavation lies a moral question. What are we ready to remember? Some knowledge was buried because it frightened those who found it. Some was forgotten simply because the world changed, and no one remained to pass it on. And some, perhaps the most profound, was silenced because it revealed too much about who we truly are. As we move through deserts, archives, and ruins, one truth begins to take shape. History is not a single line, but a spiral, turning endlessly through time. Each revolution carries fragments of the last, echoes that call out through the centuries, waiting for us to listen again. This is a journey through those echoes, through the dust beneath the stones, through the silence that follows every discovery we choose not to believe. And so we begin, not with proof, but with a question. If time forgets, must we forget with it? It began with a vibration in the sand. In 1993, as dawn broke over the Giza Plateau, a team of researchers swept the base of the Great Sphinx with ground-penetrating radar. Among them was Dr. Sakuji Yoshimura, a quiet, methodical archaeologist from Japan, more interested in data than legend. What he found that morning wasn't another tomb or chamber. It was an echo, a geometric pulse beneath the limestone pause of the monument where solid rock should have been. The radar image revealed a long metallic form, 30 meters in length, buried deep below the ancient stone. It was symmetrical, deliberate, unmistakably engineered. The readings showed density patterns unlike any known material, as though the metal beneath the Sphinx didn't quite belong to the earth that surrounded it. Yoshimura's instruments detected faint electromagnetic signatures, rhythmic waves that flickered in mathematical sequences. To his trained eye, they looked like the heartbeat of something still alive, still active after thousands of years. But what could such precision mean beneath a monument carved long before the idea of machines existed? Some called it an anomaly. Others whispered of ancient technologies or relics of lost civilizations. Yoshimura himself made no such claims. He simply described what he saw: order where there should have been chaos, pattern where there should have been dust. Soon after, the excavation area was sealed. Permissions were revoked. The desert was poured over again, like an ancient wound rebandaged. The machine, or whatever it was, returned to silence. Yet the question remains, echoing through archaeology and imagination alike. Why would a civilization of sculptors and priests embed something mechanical beneath their greatest monument? Was it ritual, symbol, or was it the same instinct that drives modern engineers, the urge to leave something functioning behind, something that endures when words and kingdoms fall? Every age builds for eternity. The Egyptians did it with stone, we with data. Both fade. Both can be buried. What Yoshimura glimpsed beneath the Sphinx might not be evidence of alien technology or forgotten empires, but something more profound, a reminder that human craftsmanship and imagination have always reached beyond their supposed limits. The lines of history may underestimate the minds that shaped our earliest wonders. Today, the sands remain sealed over the site. Tourists walk above it without knowing. The sun sets on the monument as it has for 5,000 years, light slipping down the ancient contours of its face. And somewhere below, the readings still pulse faintly in the dark, a slow rhythm of numbers and silence. Perhaps it is nothing. Or perhaps, as some believe, it is the oldest message ever left by human hands, a signal to the future, encoded in metal and myth. We were capable of more than you remember. In the wind-swept cliffs of Argentina's southern coast, where the Atlantic beats against red stone, the earth sometimes exhales the past. Fossils rise slowly out of the soil, remnants of creatures the world forgot. But in 1880, one fossil defied every category. A human form, unmistakably modern, entombed in rock 25 million years old. The geologist who uncovered it, Carlos Ameghino, was a quiet man who trusted evidence more than story. He brushed the dust away from a skull that could have been anyone's neighbor, the same curve of jaw, the same brow. It was as if time had misfiled a page, placing a modern face in a prehistoric chapter. If true, it meant that our species had walked the earth long before we were meant to exist, before apes had risen, before tools or fire or words. The fossil didn't fit the ladder of evolution. It carved a circle around it. News of the discovery rippled through scientific circles. Some dismissed it as contamination, a misreading of geological layers. Others quietly admitted the layers were undisturbed, that the dating was sound. But a theory that contradicted the accepted story of human emergence was too disruptive to embrace. The fossil was catalogued, then quietly removed from public display. For Ameghino, it wasn't a scandal. It was a mystery, a reminder that knowledge too can fossilize. Perhaps, he wrote once, we have lived many times and only remember the latest. Modern genetics now reveals strange echoes of his intuition. Traces of unknown ancestors appear in our DNA, fragments of forgotten populations that once rose, then vanished. We are, quite literally, built from memories that predate memory itself. So maybe the question isn't whether a modern human once stood in Miocene clay, but how many versions of us have already come and gone. How many civilizations have climbed the same mountain of knowledge only to vanish in ash and sand? Every discovery of an impossible human asks the same quiet question: is progress a straight line or a repeating dream? If the fossil in Argentina was real, if someone with a human mind and hands walked the earth 25 million years ago, then evolution is not merely a biological process. It's a story of amnesia and return. The mind that paints on cave walls, that measures the stars, that builds machines under monuments. It may have been here before. Science, in its patience, keeps digging. The deeper it goes, the more the strata resemble mirrors, layers of time, reflecting not what we expect, but what we've forgotten to imagine. Somewhere in the cliffs near Buenos Aires, the fossilized skull still rests in stone. The ocean continues to erode the shore, grain by grain, until one day it will surface again. And perhaps when it does, we will be ready. Not to rewrite history, but to accept that history has always been wider than our understanding. What if humanity is not the latest chapter in the story of life, but a recurring thought the planet keeps remembering, over and over, in stone, in dust, in us? In a museum storeroom somewhere between light and dust, there lies a skull made of pure crystal. It is cold to the touch, yet it seems to hold warmth, a soft shimmer, like captured breath. The story goes that 13 of these skulls once existed, scattered through the ancient cities of Central America, carved from single blocks of quartz so perfect that no tool marks remain. To the modern eye, they are beautiful impossibilities, each one fashioned with microscopic precision, as if shaped not by hand but by resonance, as if sound itself had cut the crystal. Engineers who examined them could not explain how such symmetry could exist in material so brittle, so unforgiving. Even now, the surfaces are flawless, their transparency unbroken by time. Legends claimed they could speak, not in words but in light, projecting visions when sunlight passed through them. The Maya, the Aztec, the Olmec, all cultures that revered the union of matter and spirit, saw crystal not as decoration, but as memory. In the heart of stone, they believed, was the power to remember the universe. When the skulls were rediscovered in the 20th century, they became symbols of mystery, artifacts out of place, as though carved by an intelligence that understood vibration, geometry, and consciousness itself. Scientists studied their structure and found alignments that mirrored mathematical constants, the same ratios that shape galaxies and flowers. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe a hint that the ancient artisans saw patterns we have forgotten how to see. But maybe the truth is quieter. Perhaps the skulls were never meant as proof of lost technology, but as metaphors, lessons in transparency and endurance. They remind us that memory, like quartz, survives by clarity. Each time light passes through the crystal, it refracts, bends, and emerges changed. So too does history. We look into it and see reflections of ourselves, our hunger for origins, our longing for the miraculous. Yet what it truly holds may be simpler, more human, the mark of hands that refuse to separate art from science, beauty from knowledge. A skull carved from stone, the seat of thought preserved in mineral, becomes a kind of question. How do we store wisdom across millennia? How do we leave a message that time cannot erode? Perhaps these ancient craftspeople found their answer not in words or metals, but in transparency itself, a vessel of light so pure that even the future could see through it. Today, the crystal skulls sit in vaults and archives behind glass, their origins still uncertain. Scientists debate their age, their methods of creation. The mystery remains unsolved, and maybe it should be. Because the real wonder is not how they were made, but why. To remind us that clarity is fragile, that knowledge is refracted, and that every civilization, no matter how advanced, tries in its own way to hold on to the light. In the end, the skulls may not contain secret maps or ancient equations. They may contain something rarer, a moment of human intent, frozen in quartz, the desire to be remembered not as conquerors, but as beings of light. There are places where the past hums faintly, like an old machine waiting for someone to turn the switch. Under the ancient soil of Baghdad, among the ruins of empires and empires before them, archaeologists once found small clay jars, each holding a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When dampened with vinegar, they produced a spark. The discovery seemed like a curiosity, a laboratory trick from antiquity. But the deeper they dug, the more the pattern emerged. Wires, ceramic insulators, fragments of metal that followed deliberate paths beneath the old city's foundations. It was as though someone 2,000 years ago had understood the language of electricity, not as spectacle, but as service. What kind of world might they have illuminated? Perhaps the glow of small workshops, or the gentle shimmer of light in temples. Or perhaps simply the human desire to command the unseen, to harness a current that mirrored the pulse of life itself. The scholar Wilhelm Koenig called it the Baghdad battery. He imagined that the people of Parthian Baghdad might have generated small charges for medicine, for plating, for ritual. But when he traced the fragments farther, he found alignment too consistent to ignore, a system of channels and conductors running beneath entire quarters of the old city. It was not a toy. It was a network. He documented, photographed, measured, and then, like so many before him, was told to stop. The dig was sealed, the artifacts dispersed. The electric city slipped back beneath the dust. But maybe that was fitting, for electricity has always been both discovery and metaphor, a revelation that fades if held too tightly. It represents the moment a civilization learns to see its own heartbeat made visible. Modern engineers who studied Koenig's notes recognized something familiar: the logic of a circuit, the elegance of distribution, the dance between current and resistance. The principles were ancient, yet they felt remembered, as if humanity, in rediscovering electricity in the modern age, was not inventing but remembering how to speak an old tongue. Across millennia, our cities have changed form, but not purpose. From copper wires under Baghdad to fiber optics beneath New York, from oil lamps to solar arrays, each generation rewrites the same message: we want to hold light in our hands. The electric city may never have glowed with lamps as we imagine, but perhaps its people achieved something subtler, a harmony between technology and meaning, between knowledge and awe. Their currents might have powered not machines but minds, linking ritual and science, faith and physics. Standing among the ruins today, it is hard to imagine that kind of quiet brilliance. The wind carries the scent of dust and burnt metal, the whisper of centuries gone dark. Yet if you press your hand to the ground, perhaps you can still feel it, a faint vibration, like memory traveling through the earth. Every civilization leaves behind its own electric ghost, the hum of what once was possible. The question is not how it was lost, but when we stopped listening for it. The American Midwest stretches like a memory too vast to hold. Endless fields, quiet rivers, the whisper of wind through corn and oak. Beneath that quiet earth, in the late 19th century, farmers began to uncover bones unlike any they had seen. Massive femurs, wide rib cages, skulls that seemed built for a different scale of being. They called them giants, not because they understood, but because language has no better word for astonishment. At first, these finds were treated with curiosity, even reverence. The local newspapers told stories of ancient races and forgotten kings. Scientists arrived, took measurements, sent samples to museums. But as the reports multiplied, the narrative thinned. The remains vanished into archives, then into rumor. And so the giants became what most wonders become: silence. Yet something about those discoveries lingers, not as proof of myth, but as parable. Each generation imagines its ancestors in its own image: small, clever, efficient. But what if some ancient people truly stood taller, not only in body, but in mind, in patience, in their relationship with the land? To imagine a race of giants is to imagine a world scaled to grandeur, larger doors, deeper steps, tools that required strength beyond our own. But what if giant meant something different? Perhaps those bones, whether human, animal, or symbolic, were reminders that the human story once held more variety, more wonder than our tidy categories allow. The old reports spoke of elaborate tombs, bronze tools, intricate carvings, traces of a people who lived with purpose and mastery. Whether myth or truth, the idea of giants stirs a question older than archaeology. What does it mean to outgrow the measure of one's age? We call them legends now. The Nephilim, the Titans, the Anakim, names born from awe and fear. Yet every legend begins with something tangible, a bone, a tool, a memory. Perhaps the real giants of history were those who carried knowledge that dwarfed their era, whose vision exceeded what their world could contain. Even in modern science, we find echoes of that scale, genetic anomalies that produce stature beyond norm, evolutionary branches lost to time. But deeper still lies the metaphor. Humanity itself is a species of giants, forever reaching, forever stretching toward understanding, even when the sky remains beyond our grasp. To dig up a giant skeleton is to confront the magnitude of our own smallness, to realize how fragile our scale of importance truly is. The valley that once held their bones is silent now, covered with grass and history. Yet the earth remembers weight differently than we do. It keeps the impression of every step, every story, no matter how heavy. Perhaps those immense bones were not evidence of another species at all, but a message from time itself, that the human form, like the human spirit, has always been capable of more than it appears. And so, in the heartland of America, beneath the quiet soil, sleeps a metaphor, that somewhere in our ancestry, in flesh or in memory, we were once giants. High in the Atacama desert, where the sky burns with a clarity unknown elsewhere on earth, the air itself seems older. Nights stretch wider there, and the stars feel near enough to touch. It was in this silence, in 1961, that an American archaeologist named Charles Berlitz found something that should not have been there. Thousands of carved stones, each etched with patterns that spoke a language both alien and familiar. They weren't words or pictures, they were equations. Angles that matched orbital paths, spirals that traced the curve of galaxies, numbers that repeated in sequences known only to modern physics. Some stones showed the precise position of constellations as they appeared tens of thousands of years ago, long before the first known observatories, long before the first known names for stars. Berlitz thought he had found an ancient school, not of religion, but of reason. The stones, he believed, were lessons in the mathematics of the universe, left by minds who understood that knowledge was the closest thing to immortality. Imagine that. A people who carved physics into stone, knowing that paper burns and memory fades, but rock endures. The Atacama wind has no mercy. It strips the desert to bone and salt. Yet the carvings survived. Delicate curves preserved in volcanic rock, messages from a time when thought itself was an act of devotion. When the stones were first examined, some scientists dismissed them as forgeries. Others, quietly, admitted the math was flawless. The calculations described quantum patterns, atomic structures, even principles of relativity, centuries before those ideas had names. It was as if the desert had been keeping a record of the universe, one symbol at a time. But the deeper truth may be simpler. Perhaps the people who carved these stones did not know physics as we define it. Perhaps they observed, felt, and mirrored the cosmos through intuition, as artists of precision, translating the sky into geometry. For what is science, if not the art of remembering how the universe behaves? Standing in that desert, you feel it. The sense that thought is older than language, that even before we could speak, we were measuring, tracing patterns in the sand, counting the pulses of stars. Each generation rediscovers the same equations, renames the same forces, and calls it progress. But maybe it's all remembrance. The stones of Atacama remind us that intelligence does not belong to a single era. It is a current that moves through time, touching different minds, taking different forms. And like all currents, it can vanish, buried by storms, by forgetfulness, by the human tendency to rewrite wonder into history. When the desert wind passes over those carvings today, it sounds almost like breath. The symbols shimmer in the sun, not messages waiting to be decoded, but mirrors asking a question. How much of what we call discovery is really rediscovery? Knowledge, like starlight, travels great distances. By the time it reaches us, it already belongs to the past. And perhaps, in the rhythm of those carved stones, the universe was simply teaching us the same lesson it always has, that to understand the cosmos, we must first remember that we are made of it. Deep in the green heart of Ecuador, where rivers vanish into limestone caverns and the jungle hums with unseen life, explorers once spoke of a library no one could read. They called it the Tayo's Archive, a labyrinth of tunnels hidden beneath the Andes, lined with books not made of paper, but of metal. In the mid-1970s, a Scottish explorer named Stan Hall led an expedition into those depths. He expected to find myth. Instead, by the light of his lantern, he saw rows of metallic plates stacked like books, their pages thin as leaves, yet flexible, etched with intricate symbols that glowed faintly when light touched them. Each plate shimmered with a different hue, gold, silver, copper, and an alloy no one could identify. The inscriptions were neither hieroglyphs nor letters, but geometric strokes and spirals that seemed to move as the flame flickered, as if the language itself were alive. The books, if that's what they were, told stories of civilizations unknown, maps of forgotten continents, diagrams of machines that existed only in imagination. And yet within the patterns, linguists would later notice echoes, rhythms of syntax, symmetry of grammar, the unmistakable architecture of thought. What if these weren't books at all, but memory devices? Not for human eyes, but for time itself. Every culture has imagined a way to store its knowledge: clay tablets, scrolls, codices, microchips. But metal, enduring and unyielding, belongs to eternity. To inscribe thought upon it is to declare we wanted to be remembered beyond decay. Some who studied the fragments believed the metallic pages were the work of artisans who viewed writing as sacred architecture. Each symbol, they thought, was not a letter, but an equation, a way of balancing meaning and material. Others speculated that the books were ceremonial, mirrors reflecting the human urge to preserve what cannot be preserved. Stan Hall never found an explanation. The cave entrance was later sealed. The books disappeared into rumor, like a dream misremembered. But his notes survived, sketches of metallic pages, each annotated with a single question. Who writes a story meant to be read by no one? Perhaps the answer lies not in secrecy, but in humility. Maybe those ancient minds understood that no civilization truly owns knowledge. They only borrow it, briefly, before the next wave of time washes over. The library of metal and light stands even now as a metaphor for all our archives, physical or digital. We build them to defy oblivion, yet they, too, will fade. One day, our libraries may seem as strange to future eyes as Hall's metallic pages seem to him. Still, the impulse endures. To write, to remember, to believe that knowledge itself is a form of prayer. If the library beneath the jungle ever existed, its message may have been simple, that wisdom is not meant to be hidden or owned, but rediscovered again and again by those who listen to the silence beneath the world. And perhaps that's why the books were made of metal, not because their authors feared erosion, but because they understood something profound. Even metal, in time, forgets. In the heart of the Gobi Desert, where wind carves memory into stone and horizons blur between earth and sky, there once stood a circle of bronze instruments. They were half buried, half broken, yet unmistakably deliberate, a pattern etched not by erosion, but by design. When Soviet archaeologists unearthed them in the 1950s, they found gears the size of coins, rods engraved with markings of celestial movement, and fragments of what appeared to be mechanical calendars, machines that could measure time by the turning of the heavens. No one knew their age. No inscription tied them to any known civilization, and yet their precision was undeniable. When reconstructed, even partially, the devices mapped the orbits of planets with an accuracy rivaling modern astronomy. It was as if someone, thousands of years ago, had built a language of metal to converse with the sky. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Yuri Petrov, described it as a conversation left unfinished. He believed the makers of the observatory were not priests or magicians, but engineers, dreamers who looked at the stars and decided to imitate their order on Earth. The machinery they found worked through ratios, the same harmony that defines music, architecture, and the very rhythm of life. Each gear turned another, each number mirrored a constellation. Time became tangible, a wheel of eternity. But then, as quickly as it was found, the site vanished again, sealed, forgotten, overtaken by shifting dunes. Petrov died before he could publish his full account. The desert reclaimed his instruments, his notes, and his certainty. And perhaps that's fitting, because the night sky itself is an archive, vast, indifferent, and self-correcting. The stars do not need us to watch them, yet we keep looking, as if to remind ourselves that order exists somewhere beyond our reach. Across history, humanity has built countless observatories, from stone circles to glass domes, each a reflection of our longing to measure the immeasurable. The one beneath the Gobi, whether real or imagined, represents more than ancient technology. It represents a kind of faith, the belief that the universe can be understood if we only listen carefully enough. Even today, when telescopes orbit the Earth and algorithms chart the cosmos, we remain in essence the same. Creatures tracing light across darkness, trying to turn infinity into something we can hold in our hands. Perhaps that is the true function of every observatory, not to capture the stars, but to remind us that knowledge is a form of reverence. The astronomers of the desert may have vanished, their instruments swallowed by sand, but their impulse endures. Every act of observation is a prayer, a moment when thought and wonder briefly align. If one were to stand in the Gobi tonight, the wind would sing over empty plains where bronze once gleamed. The constellations above would be the same as those the ancient engineers watched. And though their machines have rusted into silence, their question remains: can understanding survive the forgetting that time requires? In that silence between the stars, the answer glimmers faintly, as if the universe itself whispers back, "You were always part of me." The desert at Giza never sleeps. Even at night, the air hums with the weight of ages, a low resonance, as if the stones themselves are breathing. Beneath the Great Pyramid, beneath its shadow and its myths, lies a silence that no instrument has fully mapped. Long ago, explorers spoke of hidden chambers, vast corridors carved into the bedrock, machinery petrified in dust. Most of those tales dissolved into rumor. But one idea remains, persistent as the wind, that the builders of Egypt were more than masons and priests. They were engineers, dreamers who saw divinity in design. Every block of the pyramid weighs the same as a car. Every line aligns to the stars with mathematical precision. To stand before it is to feel the geometry of faith. It is not a monument to kingship, but to understanding itself, a declaration that humanity once knew how to build eternity into matter. Modern scanners reveal cavities and tunnels beneath the pyramid, voids that echo but never answer. Some say they are storage chambers. Others believe they were designed to balance the structure or to channel something invisible: air, sound, energy, prayer. Whatever their purpose, the craft is undeniable. No blueprint survives, no notes, only the result. A mountain of stone that still humbles the modern world. The Egyptians understood what we keep forgetting: that technology is not just function, but philosophy. The shape of a pyramid isn't arbitrary. It rises from the ground like a frozen ray of light, a bridge between gravity and aspiration. Every layer is a dialogue between order and chaos, mass, and meaning. Those ancient engineers worked with copper and stone, yet their precision rivals our digital machines. The blocks fit so tightly that a blade cannot slip between them. The angles align not just to the cardinal points, but to celestial coordinates. To dismiss that as coincidence is to underestimate both their patience and their poetry. In the texts they left behind, written on papyrus and carved into walls, we find no mention of power in the modern sense. No engines, no devices. But we find something deeper, an understanding that harmony itself is a form of energy. To them, sound, geometry, and motion were sacred languages. Perhaps the real machines of the pyramid were not mechanical at all. Perhaps they were conceptual, systems of balance, resonance, and proportion that transform matter into meaning. When archaeologists descend into the narrow shafts, they sometimes describe a sensation of quiet vibration, as though the stone itself remembers the hands that shaped it. It is humbling to realize that what survives of Egypt is not its rulers, but its craftsmanship, a civilization that measured its devotion in precision. Beneath the sand, there may or may not be forgotten chambers filled with lost technology. But above ground, the evidence of genius stands in plain sight. Not hidden, not erased, only misunderstood. The Great Pyramid endures because it was never merely built. It was composed. It sings to the sky in the language of proportion, and the echo it sends back is eternal. What we build is what we believe. And perhaps that is Egypt's greatest secret, that the boundary between art, science, and spirit has always been an illusion. The real technology of the ancients was not metal or power, but meaning. In the heart of the Amazon, where the air hums with life and decay in equal measure, the forest hides not ruins, but memories. Beneath the roots of ceiba trees and the shimmer of rivers that bend like living veins, archaeologists began to find patterns, straight lines, terraces, fragments of roads swallowed by green. What they revealed wasn't a single lost city, but a network, a civilization that had learned to live with the forest, not against it. For generations we imagined the Amazon as untouched wilderness, a realm of pure nature unshaped by human hands. But the soil tells another story. Layers of dark, fertile earth, terra preta, black earth, stretch across hundreds of kilometers. They are not natural, they were made. Composed from charcoal, bone, and clay, engineered to regenerate, to heal itself after each harvest. It was as if these forgotten people had understood the secret rhythm of life, how to farm without exhaustion, to build without ruin, to grow without conquest. The archaeologist Richard Thompson once described it as a civilization of harmony. His notes tell of complex villages arranged in rings, connected by pathways aligned to rivers and stars. The people who built them left no palaces, no empires, no war monuments. Their wealth was balance. They cultivated medicine from bark and roots, painted with dyes that still gleam centuries later, mapped the forest canopy as others mapped the sky. And when the time came, they let their cities dissolve back into the green, not abandoned, but reabsorbed. To modern eyes, that might look like disappearance. To theirs, it may have been perfection. When colonizers arrived, they found no towering walls, no kings, and assumed there was nothing to conquer. They could not see the genius of a society that left no scars. Yet the earth still remembers. In soil that continues to feed crops long after its makers vanished, in medicinal plants still growing where they were once tended. We often define civilization by what resists nature, stone, steel, permanence. But perhaps the highest form of civilization is one that learns to vanish gracefully. If these green civilizations were rediscovered today, they would challenge our ideas of progress. Their technology was not mechanical, but ecological. Their science was empathy. Their architecture was time itself. Modern scientists now study the black earth they left behind, hoping to learn how to reverse the damage of our own soil. In those fragments we find a mirror, not of our past, but of what our future might need to become. It is strange to think that the most advanced knowledge ever achieved may not have been about power, but restraint. The people of the forest did not seek to dominate the world. They sought to remain part of it. The canopy above them was their cathedral, the river their map, the earth their book. And though their names are lost, their lesson remains. That to endure, a civilization must learn to disappear without being forgotten. Somewhere under the Amazon rain, their gardens still breathe. And when the wind moves through the leaves, it almost sounds like a whisper, the voice of a world that once knew how to live in balance. It begins where all knowledge ends, in silence. Across continents and centuries, the traces align. Machines beneath monuments, equations carved into stone, lights buried in clay, gardens that outlived their gardeners. Each discovery seems separate, a flicker in the dark. But when viewed together, they begin to hum with the same quiet rhythm, the rhythm of remembering. Perhaps humanity has not climbed a straight ladder of progress at all. Perhaps it moves in circles, rising and falling like breath, each era rediscovering what the last had learned, then losing it again to time. In one age, we master stone. In another, we master light. In both, we forget humility. The archaeologists, the dreamers, the skeptics, they all chase fragments of an older truth. That knowledge is never truly new. It returns, dressed in different languages, wearing different hands. The crystal skull becomes the quantum equation. The desert machine becomes the microchip. The fertile earth of the Amazon becomes the blueprint for sustainability. We are not inventing the future. We are remembering it. And yet, with every rediscovery, we repeat the same mistake, believing that we are the first to know, the first to reach, the first to understand. But the ground beneath us holds the fossils of forgotten certainties, the evidence of other awakenings. History, it seems, has a short memory, but the planet does not. Civilizations vanish not because they are ignorant, but because they forget what they already know. A city that masters energy may forget compassion. A culture that perfects reason may forget balance. Progress, when divorced from wisdom, becomes another form of amnesia. The hidden discoveries scattered across the world are not warnings of conspiracy, but echoes of ourselves. Lessons written in different alphabets, all saying the same thing. Remember. Remember that technology is not triumph, but translation, an attempt to speak the language of nature. Remember that knowledge without humility becomes noise. Remember that light, no matter how brilliant, casts shadow. Each buried artifact, each vanished text, is part of a single conversation that spans millennia. The ancients asked, "What are we capable of?" We ask, "How much can we control?" And somewhere between those questions lies the heart of the human story. Maybe forgetting is not failure. Maybe it is mercy, the universe allowing us to learn again, differently, more gently. For if we carried the full weight of all our past knowledge at once, we might never move forward. Still, something in us resists the forgetting. It's what drives us to dig, to decipher, to dream. We sense that beneath every ruin lies a memory waiting to return, and we keep listening, even when the echoes grow faint. The circle closes, then begins again, not as tragedy, not as loss, but as rhythm, the great cycle of human curiosity, forever learning how to remember. Light remembers what we forget. It travels endlessly, carrying the image of every sunrise that ever was, the reflection of every face that ever looked upward in wonder. Even when the stars that birthed it are gone, the light goes on, a message still in motion. Perhaps human history is like that too. Every civilization leaves its own kind of light behind, not only in fire and electricity, but in understanding. A spark of insight, a discovery, a gesture of compassion. Each radiates outward, invisible but persistent. We are the inheritors of those radiances. The metal machines beneath the Sphinx, the stones that knew the stars, the black earth of the Amazon. They are not relics of lost empires, but afterglows of human imagination. When we rediscover them, we are not stumbling upon secrets. We are stepping into our own reflected light. It is easy to think that progress is made of invention, of new tools, new data, new power, but perhaps progress is the ability to see what has always been shining. The equations carved into rock, the perfect symmetry of a crystal skull, the geometry of a pyramid, all reveal a single pattern. That knowledge and beauty have never been separate. Light, like wisdom, has a paradox. To see, we must illuminate, but illumination also blinds. The brighter our discoveries, the deeper our shadows. Every age that learns to harness the world must also face the darkness of its own forgetting. In laboratories and deserts alike, humanity still chases the same question. How can we make the invisible visible? Electricity, sound, thought, they are all forms of light, moving through different mediums. Even memory, in its mysterious chemistry, is luminous. The neurons that recall a lost language or a buried melody flicker with electric pulses. Remembering is, in the most literal sense, a kind of shining. And yet, light cannot exist without darkness. The ancients understood this instinctively. Their temples were aligned to the solstice not only to celebrate the sun, but to honor its return from the void. To them, illumination was not conquest. It was communion, the moment when the world briefly reveals its structure and then retreats again into mystery. In the end, every act of knowledge is an act of faith. Faith that what we see matters, that the light reaching us still carries meaning. Perhaps this is what drives us to uncover, to study, to preserve. The need to keep the light moving, to ensure it doesn't end with us. Because the light that shines from the past is not lost. It is traveling still, through fiber optics and starlight, through words and song, through the soft glow of memory. It reminds us that even in the deepest forgetting, something endures. And if we listen closely, to the hum beneath the stone, to the pulse in the desert, to the whisper of the forest, we may hear what all the ancients tried to tell us in their own way. You are not separate from the light. You are its continuation. In the end, everything returns. The dust to the wind to the sea to the clouds, and memory, always, to those willing to listen. History, for all its monuments and measurements, is not a record. It is a tide. It rises, recedes, and rises again, carrying fragments of what once was, a shard of metal, a line of stone, a question whispered into the dark. We have followed those fragments across deserts and forests, through silence and speculation, trying to glimpse the shape of what came before us. Machines beneath sand, equations carved in forgotten hands, cities that breathed with the rhythm of the earth. All these remnants tell us one thing: humanity has never truly begun or ended. It has circulated, like water, like light. Each age builds its vision of eternity. The builders of Egypt shaped theirs in stone. The astronomers of the Gobi cast theirs in bronze. The thinkers of the forest wrote theirs in soil and seed. And we, the inheritors of their echo, write ours in data and glass. Different tools, same longing. We seek permanence in an impermanent world, as if we could outwit time. Yet perhaps the lesson of all buried things is gentler, that endurance does not mean resistance. It means rhythm. The pyramid stands not because it defies erosion, but because it was aligned with the sky. The forest civilizations thrived not because they conquered nature, but because they moved with it. Maybe wisdom was never lost, only waiting for us to slow down enough to recognize it. As we look back on the ruins we've unearthed, a pattern emerges, not of suppression, but of cycles. Knowledge grows, collapses, and grows again. Each rediscovery is a reminder that progress is not forward motion, but returning motion, the long return of understanding. Every civilization is a memory of light, brief, bright, and utterly human. When it fades, its energy does not vanish. It transforms. The copper wires of ancient Baghdad hum in our circuits. The equations of the Atacama reappear in our quantum theories. The geometry of Giza lives in our architecture and our art. We are not the descendants of the ancients. We are their continuation. In the quiet moments, when the machines stop, when the cities dim, when the noise of progress softens, something ancient stirs again. The same questions that moved the first engineers, the first astronomers, the first dreamers. Who are we? What are we building toward, and what will remember us when we are gone? Maybe that is the true miracle of humanity, not invention, but recollection. We are the species that forgets, and therefore must rediscover. Each time we lose the thread, we weave it anew, unaware that we are repeating the same timeless design. The long return is not tragedy, it is grace, because in forgetting, we create space for wonder to be born again. And so, as the camera pulls back, from the desert, the jungle, the stars, we see the pattern whole, a luminous spiral of knowledge and forgetting, turning endlessly through time. It is not the story of lost civilizations. It is the story of one civilization, ours, remembering itself.